And good afternoon, everybody. This is Billy from Bookstore Romance Day, and I just want to welcome you all to our Tell a Fairy Tale Day event. I'm going to turn this over to Denise, who will be our moderator today in just one moment. But first, I want to let everybody know that there is a link in the chat where you can purchase books from any of the authors. And there will also be giveaways. I have many books because the publishers were very generous. So there will be several winners of packages of books, and I will contact you via email after the event if you have won. You will also be receiving an email in the next few days with a link so that you can rewatch or share this event with your friends. And now I am going to turn everything over to Denise and take it away.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Bookstore Romance Day for organizing the discussion today. I think it's going to be a really good one. I also like to thank our guest authors. So hopefully I'm going to pronounce everyone's names right. Please forgive me. I'm a reader, so I pronounce the way I read. We have Emily Lloyd-Jones, correct?
Correct.
Leanne Schwartz. Hopefully I said that okay too. Margaret Owen, I think the easiest name up for the night. Laura Pohl, correct? Margaret Rogerson. I still wanted to make it a long O. And Alexandra Overy. How'd I do? Did I do okay? Thumbs up.
It's actually Margaret.
Oh my God, no.
Please don't do that to me. It's like I'm bad enough.
You nailed it.
So today we are going to discuss the use of fairy tales and fairy tale elements in their work as a celebration of Tell a Fairy Tale Day. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And I'm just going to kick right off with questions. So this is for all y'all, so you guys can decide who gets to answer first. When you are writing retellings, so retellings are pretty popular right now, at least in our bookstore. When you're writing retellings, how do you choose what parts of the known story must be kept? And what elements, how do you decide what elements you can modify for the story?
Go first, Molly. I see you want to answer.
I mean, I was always the kid in the class who was sitting there like, I'm going to put my hand up, even though you're not going to call me first. But I was thinking about this earlier, actually, so that's probably why I have an answer. I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind with fairy tales is that they're stories told basically like, you know how when you have an animal, you need to feed a pill, you put it in a pill pocket. They're morals and important lessons that are put in a delightful, horrible pill pocket for kids, right? And you have to, or when you're doing a retelling, the real big question is, do you want to repeat that pill, or do you want to be like, oh, surprise, there's a filling of something completely different in here, like we're going to take this story about inheritance and flip it and be like, no, what is the story really about? Is it about identity? And when you are doing a retelling, that idea, getting down to the thing underneath the pill pocket is how you figure out what parts you're going to keep and what parts you're going to change, because you want to, like, if you were to do a Cinderella retelling, and your focus, it's like a straight up and down Cinderella retelling. Honestly, I think the biggest thing that most people are going to be looking for and resonating with is the idea that this girl is going to show up to a ball somewhat in disguise, but not having done a whole lot to change herself, and be good as anybody else in the rest of the ballroom. And if you're doing a Cinderella retelling about the stepsister, there's a whole other thing that you might want to keep. You might not even care about the ball scene, or the ball scene might be something completely different. It might be, oh, I've worked really hard to get here, and now someone with a fairy godmother is coming up and stealing my spot. What is that about? So yeah, when you get to the pill under the pill pocket, which is definitely not the part I was thinking about earlier, as I was feeding my cat pills with pill pockets, that really is what, to me, is how I determine what part of a retelling I'm going to keep, or what I'm going to keep from that story, and what I'm going to change. Speaking of cats.
Well, I'm so glad you answered, because in your book, in the relationship, okay, and hopefully I've got the right book. I think I do. The relationship between Varja and Gazelle, right? That's your book, right?
Very close. Vanya and Giselle. Yeah, but yeah.
Okay, I'm so horrible at
It's
pronouncing
all good. It's all
word
good.
names. In the beginning, it seems like a fairly simple relationship, but it really isn't. And I loved how their personal growth like wove together and how their environment and culture came into the play. But it kind of, to me, and again, I know like a lot of the old fairy tales, because they were told orally, there's multiple different versions of the story, right? But to me, it turned Goose Girl on its head. And I feel like it kind of exposed some of the cliches in some of the older fairy tales, especially like cultural standings and who's the good person and who's the bad person based on cultural like levels. Was that a planned exposure in your book?
One of the things that I was thinking about, because the one of the sort of founding kernels of Little Thieves was this idea of a con artist who is impersonating a socialite. And I was like, oh, well, that could be the Goose Girl in reverse. And then when I was revisiting the Goose Girl, I noticed that, you know, I was sort of dwelling on the idea that in the story, well, sort of two things, and not to go on too long about this, but the first one was that in the book, the princess has to, after her identity is stolen, when she's pretending to be a servant, she's basically hiding her beautiful golden hair. But when that is revealed and her true beauty is revealed, that's how they know she's a princess. And I was like, that's a warped idea to that's not a good pill in that pocket. And the other thing that stuck out to me was in the story, the sort of inciting incident is the main character, or is you know, the character who's played by Vanya in Little Thieves, basically saying, or like being asked, you know, we're on a trip, we're on a road trip, we're both riding horses, you're riding the bad horse, you're wearing rags, and I need, you know, and the princess is like, I need you to get down and get me water from the spring. And the maid does the horrible thing of saying, you can also get your own water. You are equally capable of this. And that becomes this moment of pure villainy of her saying, there's no reason for me to do this thing for you. And then her villainy only compounds by saying, actually, no, you know what? I'm the princess now. I'm going to wear the nice clothes and ride the nice horse. And it's your turn to wear the bad clothes and ride the bad horse. And like, no one says why the princess was inherently deserving of those things in the first place. And I really wanted to sort of get into that and be like, is it really inheritance-based capitalism the real villain here? But that's a whole other.
You did it well.
Thank you.
It came through.
Like this cat came through.
Hi. So, Emily, I have a question for you next. The Drowned Woods and the Bone Houses are set in the same world, the Kingdom of Wales, correct?
Yes, it's faux Wales, as I like to say.
It's so scary being the moderator because I'm like, please don't mess up and talk about the wrong book to the wrong author. But the stories are completely different. Are they based on different Welsh fairy tales?
They are. Wales has a very long history of fairy tales and folk tales, and delving into them has been a lot of fun. For the Bone Houses, which for those who are not aware, it's basically medieval zombies is my two-word pitch. And it is based on the folktale of the Cauldron of Rebirth, which is basically about a cauldron that can supposedly raise the dead. However, these dead can't speak, can't die again, and just kind of like shamble around. And I was reading this going, well, they're zombies, right? So I decided to basically just make them zombies. And for the Drowned Woods, there is a very old folktale about the Cardigan Bay and about how that was formed. Originally, it was supposed to have been a kingdom all to itself, sort of like the Welsh Atlantis. And when I was doing research for the Bone Houses, I stumbled on this little snippet about this young lady who was supposedly the keeper of this magical well, and it was all her fault that this kingdom was drowned. And me, of course, I was like, they blame the young lady, always. So I was sitting here going like, what would the story be from her perspective? So I decided to pull on that folktale. So yeah, two completely different folktales, but I like to set them in the same world because once I did all that world building, I was like, you know what, I'm going to reuse this.
Excellent. And the whole time I was reading the Drownwoods, in my head, it was happening in the world of Poldark. Has anybody watched the Poldark series on Masterpiece?
I've heard it's really
Only
good.
me. Like that's what it looked like in my head, and I'm sure it's completely wrong, but that was my world while I was reading the Drownwoods. Okay, Laura, I have a question for Laura now. I am a huge fan of dark academia stories, and I'm so happy they're so popular right now. And I'm jealous of teens, so you can probably tell by my hair, I'm definitely not a teen. But I'm jealous of teen girls who get to read these books as teens, because I didn't have these as a teen. And particularly stories like the Grimrose Girls, where the teens put their friends first. Because I feel like a lot of the books when I was a teen that I was reading, like that's not how it worked. The friends were always doing something to each other versus building each other up. So how did you determine with your girls kind of having origin stories, right? How do you determine how the girls will interact with each other while keeping true to their origin stories?
I'm a huge fan of stuff that mashes up a lot of stuff together, and it just is a whole big mess. So I'm a great fan of Once Upon a Time, which has been obviously one of the inspirations for Grimrose Girls, because when I watched it, I was absolutely obsessed with Regina, and I was like, oh, why are they so bad to her? She's just an evil woman. Let her do what she wants. And this is my whole personality, unfortunately. But I think the idea that I wanted exactly to set it in a school, because I think school friendships work differently than the relationship that you build with other people in your life, especially friends later on with college and everything. But school, you're doing everything together. Like when you're at school is your pretty much your life. You have some activities that sometimes you do outside, but usually like the center of your social life is at school. And I think it's really important that young girls just get to be praised for their friendships and understand that they're really fundamental to who you want to grow up with and who you want to be, actually. So I think same as with you when I was started reading at YA, like I was 14, 15, it was 15 years ago now already. But there were a lot of books as well, and it was just all the focus on all of the books were just romance. And I love me some good romance. I will not diss it in general, but I was just really annoyed that every time it turned out like the best friend was just an evil bee for some reason. And it was just really, I love my friends, and being on the aromantic spectrum as well, like friendships were my kind of like my go-to every time. Like I didn't have boyfriends, I didn't have girlfriends, I had friends as I was growing up. And these friends remain with me even until today, though our friendships have changed and developed into something different. Sometimes we spend more time not talking to each other, like a whole month, and then you're like, oh, how are you doing? I remember you told me this, like, did it work out? And so like these friendships are just important, and they are just as important as romance. And I think teenage girls get to see that on the page. And for the interaction scenes, kind of like each girl represents a fairy tale, I kind of had, going back to the first question that you asked, I chose kind of elements that would feel familiar from the fairy tale. So they're just, I did not take Molly's approach, which is more thematic, like how am I gonna do the themes of this fairy tale? I was just like, oh, how do we recognize Cinderella as being Cinderella? Does it have to be a ball? We have to have like a shoe scene. And we have to have like, oh, she has an evil family somehow, and she interacts with them, and she's very like, she's stuck in this abusive household. And what does Snow White look like? We know there is an evil stepmother, and that's important. And you have the apple. So like I try to bring these elements in, but they're more towards the plot than the actual themes. They're just things that are happening. So it was easy to make them interact as genuine characters with a personality all of their own, instead of just having to bring their personalities from the fairy tales. Because if we're honest, like some of these fairy tales, I love fairy tales, but they're very flat in character development. If you're good, you get rewarded. And if you're bad, you just, I don't know, get decapitated or something. And that's it. Those are the two options. Be good and you get like a prince and you get married and have kids and live in a castle, and be bad and like stuff's gonna happen to you. Some birds are gonna peck out your eyes, and then your feet are gonna bleed forever. I don't know. So I feel like I try to take off these morals of black and white and just leach them out of it and be like, oh, I want to work on these genuine friendships. And that was the most important thing. Like true love, and the idea that true love saves is a good one, but true love doesn't have to be romantic.
Leanne, A Prayer for Vengeance isn't out yet. So I'm basing my question on a very brief description that I read. So please correct me if I misread it. So I'm not sure that I previously thought of Ovid's Metamorphosis as a traditional fairy tale per se, but that's what I think of when I think of stories with statues that come to life, when Venus brings the statue to life in answer to her prayer. Was there an inspiration for the story of, is it Gia? Is Gia right?
Yeah.
Okay. Particularly the idea of her being turned into a statue and then brought back to life through prayer.
Yeah, I think that, Italian fairy tales and folk tales go all the way back to Roman and Greek stories. You see little traces evolving from, Strix to Strega to witches and fairy tales. So definitely Ovid and Pygmalion and all of that was in my mind. And, we have Medusa and lots of stories and fairy tales in the Italian tradition are, a girl is so good and she gets turned into a gold statue and gets a prince, and her sister is so bad and she gets dumped in a vat of oil. So lots of stories of turning to stone or turning back from stone. One of my favorites is a merchant girl builds her bridegroom out of marzipan, and he comes to life. So I was like, oh my God, that's like the proto cinnamon roll, like love interest. But Milo's the love interest. He doesn't pray Gia to life to be his girlfriend, but for her bravery to come alive. So that was kind of like twisting the story a little. And then looking at, instead of the Pygmalion and Galatea, looking at like what the ideal womanhood is, just like, what do we idealize through statues? What's the history that they're telling through it? And then when Gia comes to life and just starts murdering everybody in power, Milo has to contend with, what direction she wants to send that bravery in to get justice, that it's less expected than what he might have thought.
Okay, I have another question for everyone. So whoever wants to jump in. When you're creating a fairy tale rather than doing a retelling, what are the necessary elements? Like, how do you make the story feel like a fairy tale, even though it's a brand new story? Anyone want to jump in?
I'm going to sort of go back to what Laura was saying and say one of the things for me is, if you watch Once Upon a Time, I feel like it captures fairy tale vibes really well in a completely different setting. I feel like watching that, for whatever reason in my head, shifts the tone. So I think it's a huge amount of it is tonal. In a sort of fairy tale or fairy tale retelling, you don't necessarily have rules in the same way that you would have to in a sort of high fantasy book. You can go with the kind of like, someone can like rip their heart out of their chest and, give it to someone else. And we can have bargains for like years of your life. And those all sort of fit within that tradition. So I think, it's just accepting that you can sort of go out a little bit and go sort of tonally be like, okay, I can do this. I can do these sort of slightly strange, whimsical things. And I don't have to have set rules or reasons for them in the same ways that I would if I was doing like a, sort of regular like high fantasy adventure or something. And also just, again, using the archetypes that everyone sort of mentioned. It's so interesting actually hearing everyone talk about this and how I feel like there's the same seed with all of us of like women in fairy tales being treated badly. So we're going to reclaim them, which is great. And it's sort of coming back to those archetypes. Like, I think as readers, we're very aware of the different archetypes of fairy tales, even if we don't think about it, because that was so much of like what so many stories we're like brought up on have grown from. So I think, yeah, being aware of the structure and the tone, but then also still being able to sort of pull it into something that it's your own. I don't know if that's that helpful, but
Nice. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, this is a good one for me because I've never written an actual retelling. But my first book, An Enchantment of Ravens, I definitely see it as a fairy tale, and it was my goal for it to read like a fairy tale. And I constructed actually the whole idea of the book, which is that in this setting, the fair folk cannot perform craft, which is any act of creation. They can't cook, they can't compose music, they can't paint, they can't make clothing, or else they'll crumble into dust. And that's something that only humans can do. So in order to obtain anything like that, the fair folk have to trade with humans. And that idea actually came from this really interesting piece of folklore that as a kid I always found fascinating, which is that you can use bread to protect yourself from fairies or repel them. So there's even this tradition of, there are all the different things you can do to protect yourself from fairies, like wearing your clothing inside out or hanging scissors above your bed or anything or something like that. But you can also put a piece of bread in your pocket. And apparently, actually quite recently, this was still a tradition in Canada, which I found really interesting. Actually, a reader reached out to me about that, and she said that her husband's parents had him do that. They would send him out with a piece of bread in his pocket to protect him from fairies. I thought that was really interesting. But the idea behind it is that the act of baking bread is transformative. You're taking something from nature and you're turning it into something else. So the whole idea of the hearth and such being an oppositional force to fairies, who are wild creatures of nature. And the hearth represents, the taming of nature and all of that. So that was actually the idea behind the craft in Enchantment of Ravens.
Anyone else have any thoughts before I move on?
I think, honestly, the thing that sort of sets a fairy tale tone to me is that there are rules that we generally are like, why would this work this way? And part of the story is the main character at least figuring out what the rules are, if not why they work the way they do. Like they might know that, a fairy can't bake bread, but they don't necessarily know that, or they haven't made the connection that it's the transformative act, but they might get there by the end of the story. And that idea of engaging with rules that are sort of unspoken and almost or very mysterious and unfathomable in ways. I think that sort of sets the tone for me. Like, sure, you can transplant a heart and it'll be totally fine. They'll be talking animals. No questions here. That's normal, I guess. That sure, you've got a fairy godmother. Why wouldn't you have a fairy godmother? It's figuring out the rules of that really sort of set the tone and figure out, lay the groundwork for the story itself.
Okay, so it works out perfectly that you finished the question again, because my next question was for you once again. And so we already talked about Little Thieves is based on the Goose Girl, and where a servant forces a princess to trade places with her. So the princess becomes the Goose Girl, and the young in the one that I've read, the young boy she works with goes to the king and says something's weird about this Goose Girl, right? But animals are a big part of the Goose Girl. And I feel like animals are a big part of a lot of fairy tales. In Little Thieves, how do you feel the animals fill an important element? Do you feel the animals fill an important element of the fairy tale structure?
I would say in Little Thieves less to a degree, but it kind of in relation to fairy tales in broad, I feel like they're a great way to establish that we are entering a new set of rules, and that if there is a talking animal, sure, maybe it's fine to the protagonist, but for the reader, you're like, that shouldn't be happening. That's your indication that this is a completely different arena that you are entering. For Little Thieves, I think animals aren't necessarily as prevalent, but one of the main characters is a shapeshifter, and she's basically a feral, half human, half god. And she has a lot of qualities that I sort of deliberately made animalistic, where she's trusting in some circumstances, not trusting in others. And she's very straightforward. Like, you don't have to sit, if you were to sit down with a bunch of wolves and be like, well, I have several policy proposals, and here's how they would also enrich my personal wealth, the wolves would still eat you at the end of the day. And that's very much where that character is. Like, she's like, I don't know what policy procedures, I don't know what that means, but I do know that you're a bad person and you're made of delicious meat. So we can cut to the chase here, except for she is a vegetarian. But point being, I think with Little Thieves, a lot of the stories about the idea of regaining trust, and for the main character, having that character be present, was really sort of, it was instrumental to her being able to do that, simply because there is no deeper level with that character. It's like, what you see is what you get, and what she says is what you get. And having that sort of unvarnished honesty and forthrightness it was absolutely key to being, for the main character to sort of rebuild her ability to trust people. For one thing, it's not just that it can be done, but that someone else can do it. And it's very, I think it is emotionally very challenging to be honest a lot of the time. It's a lot easier to lie and to distance yourself from your feelings. And seeing someone who she initially views as sort of like an annoyance and just not very bright, be like, no, actually, I'm very smart and powerful. I just don't have time for this BS. That was very instrumental to her being like, okay, well, so maybe we have to do some reflection on this. Maybe I have to sit with that for a little bit.
So Emily, speaking of fairies and animals, Emily, having lived in England, I have heard a lot of stories around corgis and fairies. And of course, your book has that in it. Can you explain the connection and why it's so perfect for Fane to have a corgi as a companion? And why also, because I have a sheepdog at home, why is it better for Mare, I pronounced it Mare when I read it, to have a sheepdog companion?
Well, I like writing animal companions because I really love animals, as you can probably tell, because there's a cat that has just been like getting on and off my lap this entire time. And for this particular book, I wanted an animal that was intrinsically tied to the Fae in Welsh folklore, which of course are corgis. In a lot of Welsh fairy tales, they're used as messengers or even like steeds, which I think is hilarious. Just like tiny little corgi steeds. So when I was coming up with the idea of Fane, who is a character who has worked for the other folk, the Fae of his land, for several years now, him leaving the land and being accompanied by one of their very much like little messengers, I thought was funny because it's like this big burly guy just accompanied by this tiny little adorable dog. But also I like the world building that since they are tied to the Fae, people who haven't had a whole lot of dealings with them are extremely suspicious of corgis. They're basically spies. Like, do not let a corgi in your house. They're going to report back to the Fae. You don't know what they're seeing. You don't know what they're doing. So I just like the idea that everyone is really suspicious of this tiny little dog that is just following him around. As for the sheepdog, I specifically picked one because Mare, on the other hand, is a little bit more of a working dog type person. She's very like trying to find her own life and build one, and having a dog that is intrinsically tied to the land and livestock felt very in character for her.
Alexandra, the Firebird tale has a lot of different stories as well. From what I could find, many of them seem to involve a quest, and the bird is generally considered both a blessing and a harbinger of doom at the same time. I do feel like doomed quests are pretty common in fairy tales. Why do you think we enjoy these stories of doomed quests so much?
It's a great question. Why do we love tragedies like you know, if I read a book and I'm like, oh my God, this entirely emotionally destroyed me, my first reaction is I must make all my friends read it. And like, it's great. I'm like, this book, you know, completely killed me. Everyone should read it. It's amazing. But yeah, we love, I don't know, we love the idea of people trying their best and trying against all the odds. And perhaps we love as well the fact that it shows the realism of life a little bit more. It shows that you know, it's sort of that sort of dichotomy of fairy tales. You have fairy tale, the idea of a fairy tale ending, which sounds like something very good and happy, but actually a lot of fairy tales do not end very happily. So it's that sort of, yeah, weird dichotomy of like, actually fairy tales can be kind of tragic and quite bad, depending on what version you read, what sort of different story tradition it comes from, all those sorts of things. So yeah, I think we just connect with the sort of humanity of it, with the fact that like realistically in life we fail a lot of the time, and sometimes it's nice to process it through something else. I always think any kind of fantasy is like a very nice lens to process things of the real world through, because it feels slightly separate, it feels a little bit safer, we're not entirely in the real world. And so I think there's something to it that's slightly cathartic to read. Like, you know, when you read that book that you cry massively at the end and it hurts and it's painful, but it also is a little bit cathartic. And I mean, I guess we've been obsessed with it for a long time, because as you say, like a lot of the fairy tales, a lot of the versions of the Firebird have quite tragic endings. But it's also why it's interesting reading different versions, because as you said, you saw a few different ones, but every sort of different version takes a slightly different take on it. So you do have the Firebird as well, where it sort of comes along and helps out, and we end up on our like jolly little quest. And then the same person takes that story and tells it slightly differently, and it ends with sort of huge tragedy. And I mean, I think that's also the fun of fairy tale retellings, is there's so much you can do with it and so much you can pull from the source material, and there's nothing is wrong because everyone brings something slightly different to them. And that's why I love reading them as well. It's like we could read, you know, the same, I don't know, Cinderella retelling from 10 different people, and they're going to be so different and such different takes on it. And yeah, I think that's something that's very fun about it, is that you get that chance to pull different things out. I slightly went off topic there, but yes. Also Doom Quest.
You made me think of one time I heard an interview, I think it was Kate DiCamillo, and she had asked a group of students like why they all loved Charlotte's Web, right? Because it makes you cry. Every time you read it, you're going to cry, or watch the movie, you're going to cry. And one of the kids said back to her, well, because then I know I can get through it. Like, I know I'll be okay afterwards. And I feel like that is so true of books. Like, so many books rip your heart out, but you're like, okay, everybody needs to read this now because we're going to be okay. My heart will go back, you know, like I'm going to make it through this. So I think
I can't suffer alone.
You can't suffer on your own. You must make all your friends suffer.
Yeah. And then we'll drink wine and talk about it. Yeah. Okay, Margaret Rogerson. I feel like you have mastered the art of turning the bad guy or girl into a good guy or girl by the end of the story. And that might just be my personal take, but that's how I feel. Do you see that as an element of fairy tales? So we talked about how fairy tales often have very flat characters, but I do feel like a lot of fairy tales do have the bad guy becoming the good guy also. Do you feel like that's a common element, I guess?
Yeah, you know, Beauty and the Beast is one of my favorite fairy tales, which is, I mean, it's like everybody's, right? But I've always been fascinated with just the idea of the monstrous, I guess. I kind of joke that I only ever tell one story, which is about a relationship between like a human and a monster. That's the same story that I'm telling over and over in every single book. I just find that fascinating to explore. I don't know if it's something that came out of my love of folklore and fairy tales, or if it's just some weird thing that I really like for some reason. But yeah, maybe it goes back to Beauty and the Beast. I know that the book that inspired me to write was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. It was Robin McKinley's Beauty. And I read that actually on a snow day, my junior year of high school. It was kind of a wild story. It was this is back in the days when ebooks were not readily available, and we'd had a terrible ice storm the night before. So the schools were closed, everything was closed, but I didn't have a book. So like any self-respecting reader, I was like, I need to risk my life to go get a book right now. And the book that I wanted to read was Beauty by Robin McKinley. So I got in the car. I was like the only person on the road because the conditions were so dangerous. And I remember I actually couldn't stop the car because there was so much ice. So I was just rolling through the red lights, like very slowly. There's actually a policeman parked in a grocery store parking lot, and I saw his head just slowly turning to watch me as I slowly slid through the red light. The ridiculous thing is that the library was open. I don't know how the librarians did this. The library was like the only thing that was open that day. I didn't see anyone on the road, but somehow the librarians got to the library. So I picked up my copy of Beauty and I survived the drive home, and I read it that afternoon, the whole thing. And after I finished, I remember thinking, I want to write books that will make people feel exactly the way that I felt when I was reading this book. So I don't know, maybe it all stems from there. I don't know.
That's fantastic.
I think that's a good goal to have. I want to write a book that makes someone just slowly roll through a red light.
Yeah, right.
My book. Margaret, also, so in Mysteries of Thorn Manor, Elizabeth battles animated topiaries. So kind of moving on from the animals to plants, like, can you explain the use of magical plants in fairy tales and why it's important in your books?
Oh, I think I just like making things be alive that are not really supposed to be alive. And that's, of course, a theme that you see in fairy tales a lot. Going back to Beauty and the Beast, they're all the living. Well, I suppose it depends on whether you're talking about the Disney version or a different version. But the Disney version has all the animated household objects. I've just always found that to be fun. I enjoy writing about that sort of thing.
Okay, I gotta make sure I'm not losing my place here. Okay, Alexandra. As part of the world, a part of your book's world, there are various gods and saints. How do you go about creating a religion for your fairy tale world?
I mean, I think specifically for These Feathered Flames, it kind of came fairly naturally because of the way that Russian folklore sort of evolves. It's very steeped in ideas of like sort of more Western influence, so like sort of 16th century Russia, sort of Christianity and ideas of gods and saints were very tied up in folklore. So it felt a fairly natural progression just from like all the stories I was reading and things like that. It's also, so I was a history major in college, so world building is always my favorite thing. So I sit down at the beginning and I'm like, okay, here's all this in detail that I will never need, but I have it. So I really enjoy things like creating religions because it's such a sort of fundamental basis for so many beliefs in this world that you create. And as a world I knew was based for me on sort of this fantasy idea of historical Russia. So it was, a real magical sort of place. And because it had that combination, I really wanted to try and bring that feeling in, that sort of mix of, we have folktales and we have saints, we have a sort of set religion of this world, as well as the overall beliefs and the way those two sort of interacted. Yeah, I mean, it was very fun coming up with the saints because I just basically went through different like fairy tale ideas and brought different aspects in. Again, lots of tragic stories there. Saints always have to have tragic stories, but yeah, and I think it's just such a fun part of world building because it sets, again, tonally, it sets the tone. It makes it feel fairy tale-esque if that's what you're going for. And it just sort of like, yeah, it gives you this basic idea of the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Leanne, so if I understand right, Gia turns on her love after he turns on her sister, correct? Did I read that?
Right. Her crush, who is
Milo.
No, Ennio. There's
original crush. Sorry.
Original crush. Yeah.
Don't like him.
No, don't like him.
He doesn't get any nice.
So we talked about the trend of friendship and how we've sort of modernized it to make the friendships part of a love story, right? how do you feel about like sisterhood in traditional fairy tales versus more modern fairy tales? Because I feel like we've really started to embrace the idea of sisterhood and the love between sisters. Can you kind of
Yeah.
fill that in by-
Yeah, there's so many sisters in traditional fairy tales, but they do tend to be like the good sister, the bad sister. But it's, and sometimes, they save each other and they turn each other back from stone and or pull each other out of hell and things like that. But it's really fun seeing people in modern books be able to take that and add so much more nuance and layers to it, like with Vanya and Giselle, or your twin sisters with the Firebird and the Queen, just looking at all the angst and the layered emotions, and just they might want to tear each other apart half the time, but like nobody else better touch them. So just looking at sisterhood with more nuance, and just it's tied up with identity and jealousy and power dynamics. And there's so much more there than just like, this was the good sister and this was the bad sister. And she was nice to the cats and she was mean to the cats. So Gia, feels very left out by her sister, who has a lot of responsibility and power in their world, and Gia does not, and goes looking for it and finds all the wrong places. But in that moment of betrayal, the power of sisterhood wins out, and that's how she ends up turned into a statue as well, which is not a spoiler, it's in the prologue. But that's the power of sisterhood, will take you through 1,000 years of stone even. So while your sister is, stabbed like Saint Sebastian, really.
That's a lot of stabbing.
Yeah, quite a bit. It's very motivating.
Laura, so we brought up Disney. So I have a question for you that kind of relates with Disney. So the Grimrose Girls is, to me, definitely a Grimm's fairy tale versus a Disney fairy tale. Do you find that you often have to explain this, that your fairy tale is a Grimm's fairy tale versus a Disney? How do you feel about the Disney-fied fairy tales, and do you feel the need to include elements of the Disney retellings in your own stories?
I think at this point, not to be promoting Disney, which I'm against as a whole, especially one to just I have an unusual beef with Disney in regards to fairy tales, is that they did The Descendants, which I'm not sure many of you watched. Unfortunately,
please, I have two teenagers. We watch it all the time.
Exactly. I watch a lot of stuff for teenage girls or just young girls in general. Like I was a huge My Little Pony Friendship is Magic fan. Like for years, I've watched all the seasons. But the thing is, like Disney shut down my actual favorite retelling mashup, which was Ever After High, and because they were doing The Descendants. And they were like, no, we can't have fairy tale kids off the same concept, so you have to shut down. So they bought it, like they paid Mattel a lot of money to shut Ever After High, and they got to do The Descendants. So this is my villain origin story for Disney. But I think at this point, like Disney versions are just incorporated into how we view fairy tales, because sometimes they are the first contact we have with them for so many kids. So I think it's normal that they have these idea of what their fairy tales look like. And often, like Disney just really embellishes stuff. They just add on more stuff. Like you have, again, Margaret said about the talking cutlery and everything, and it's fun. It's not there on what we call the original, but it's still like they have some fun additions. And I think at this point, they're just a part of the culture, like the way Disney incorporated things. Sometimes we just see like, oh yes, Belle has to come back by the time that the last petal on the rose, she has to declare herself. And not all the original stories of Beauty and the Beast actually have the rose that just crumbles out. You have the rose that her father steals from the Beast and that gets her there in the first place, and that's it. So I think at this point, when I was working with it, I don't feel like I come up with a lot of this question. It doesn't come up a lot, because I think I do make sure that the book goes really gory. And my editor was like, can we tone this down? This is still for teenagers. Because I had a really great decapitation scene, and she was like, let's have none of that. Please just tone it down a little bit.
But teenagers love decapitation.
Yeah.
That's what, like, I would personally, as a teenager, I would be obsessed with a decapitation scene, but we cut that out.
Especially teen girls.
Yes. Now, sometimes they do have to go. You still have someone kind of like eating a heart at some point in the story. I cannot tell who, but it's a really gross scene that I'm really proud of it. But I think just adding that on with the story and what I was working on, it kind of like, you know what the vibe is going to be. Like, these are deaths and these are going to be gory. And explicitly, they have the connections to the fairy tales, like it's explicit inside the story. That's the story theme. Like with the Grimmauld Girls, they find a book of fairy tales, and all the fairy tales are like the bad. So when this comes up in the story, you know it's gonna be all bad, all tragedy all the time. Like these are when people are gonna die, and just everybody's gonna have like a really, really awful time. And so I think it kind of like cuts off the Disney version. You can still recognize some beats and pieces. I think inevitably you have some references, even as I was doing this, but it kind of like, it's just a little bonus and a little flavor. And instead I prefer to work with the Grimm versions, or just the usually awful versions of everything else, because I was just throwing stuff in there. I'm just like, yes, give me everything. Just let's do everything. And
I have to make the comment, Laura and Alexandra, as a book nerd, as a bookstore owner, I have to read everybody's titles behind them. And I love that Gideon is so like front and center for both of your.
I love Gideon. Ali was like, yes, a book that's kind of tragic and you have to make everybody read it. Like my friends can't stand me anymore. Like Gideon kind of like ending friendships because they're like, stop talking. And I worked as a translator in Brazil, and I got to translate Gideon, which was a nightmare on all its own, but I'm very proud of it. At the same time, obviously what happened was that I was talking about the book all the time. That was like the only thing I ever talked about. So yes, read Gideon. It's great.
Yeah, make everyone read Gideon, please.
Now, does that mean you get the manuscript early?
Unfortunately not. I tried that, to be honest. I am still waiting for elective like everybody else.
I can also see Vespertine on Alexandra's shelf, I think, too, right by Gideon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, the book nerd in me
my favorite
try to read your books while you're talking. So speaking of Vespertine, Margaret Rogerson, I read that you described Mysteries of Thorn Manor as an author writing fan fiction for their own work. Is that accurate?
Yes.
What makes Mysteries of Thorn Manor fall under the category of fan fiction?
I think it just has the same sort of feeling. It's very much a comfort read with low stakes. Not that that's how all fan fiction is, but I think I enjoy reading fan fiction when I'm, feeling down or have very little energy, and it's just a place you can turn to get a little bit more of the characters that you like. And yeah, I personally love it when books feel like fan fiction. When you start reading a book and you're just instantly invested in the characters, and it's just so I guess it satisfies the id. I think that's what I like about fan fiction. So I suppose because when I wrote Mysteries of Thorn Manor, it was during COVID lockdown, and I was really depressed, and I just wanted to I'm not a writer of fan fiction, so for me this is the next best thing, is sort of writing fan fiction of my own work. I just wanted the writing version of fan fiction. I wanted to sort of discover what that was. So yeah.
Margaret Owen. So I am a big fan of Merciful Crow, and I have to say, I think it was Winter Institute the year before it came out. You were there, and I got a signed ARC while I was at Winter Institute, so I got to read it before it came out. And I am a total sucker if there's a crow, and ravens too, because I can't tell the difference between a raven and a crow. If there's a crow on the cover, I'm going to read it. So what do you think like compels, is it Poe, is it Edgar Allan Poe that makes us all love, what is it that we all love crows like so much? Like
Ooh.
I am obsessed. I will read anything that has a crow.
So I think it's a combination of a couple things. For one thing, crows and ravens show up in a ton of mythology as tricksters, as guides, as like really cool like eldritch figures, and also as just complete jerks. And it's great. And you never know which end you're gonna get. And you have all these stories about everything from like the crows who were fed, and they bring little gifts to the people who were feeding them, to the Canuck, the Canadian crow who was photographed holding a knife at a crime scene. Everybody likes, I think the unpredictability of crows, and the fact that they're like, they're obviously very smart, but they very clearly like to engage in the world in a way that we don't necessarily see with a lot of animals, and that they're very clever and cunning, and sometimes they'll just mess around just to mess around. And I think one of the other things that I remember reading in, I think, Crooked Kingdom, which I was like, that was a good way to sort of tie that all together, is something that is backed by science, which is that crows do remember faces, and they remember the people who helped them and the people who hurt them. And I think for a lot of people, that's very resonant. It's like, I remember these people who were there for me in my lowest moments, and I remember the people who put me there, and I think
I remember reading an article about
Yeah.
crows remembering the people who do bad,
Yeah.
right? And I was like, ooh, authors have known that for a really long time, because like, I feel like that's there in so many
There's a scientist who works at a university near where I live, who studies crows, and she actually found that they not only hold funerals for their dead, but like they will warn like other crows about someone approaching who they think is a threat, which is also just wild. But yeah, it's I think a PBS video. It's like 3 minutes long if you look up crow funerals, and it involves the most haunting mask I have ever seen. So if you want to curse yourself, you should watch it.
I watch a lot of documentaries. I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, the mask with the face and the hair and like the peanuts. Yeah, I can no more describe it to you. This is a journey you must undertake yourself. It's but it's so haunting.
Alexandra, these feathered flames and this cursed crown are both applauded for your world building. And I think you mentioned that when you build your worlds, you are very conscious of that. But how do you make sure it feels like a fairy tale when you're building those worlds?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because of the books I've published, the three of them, I have These Feathered Flames duology, and then my middle grade, they're all fairy tale retellings, but in very different tones. Obviously, because one is middle grade, one is YA. So, and then the book I'm currently working on is not to do with fairy tales at all. So I feel like it's been an interesting process going through and trying to like actually examine what makes something feel fairy tale-esque as opposed to what makes something feel sort of like straight fantasy. And to be honest, I don't know if I can even pinpoint it exactly. I feel a lot of writers must be like this, right? Not just me. I have such a set tone in my brain of how a book should feel as I'm writing it, and if it doesn't, I can't write. Like I have to go back and be like, no, something is wrong, and I can't always pinpoint exactly what, but it's some kind of tonal thing. And I think for me, it's very much like immersing in. I mean, I'm deadly serious when I say I rewatched Once Upon a Time almost obsessively when I was writing the sequel for This Cursed Crown, because I couldn't get the tone right for the book, and I needed to have something fairy tale in the background to like get me. Also, because I love Regina as well. Unapologetically, yes. And I think for me, that's something that always really helps, is if you're going for a specific tone, a specific type of world, is sort of trying to intake as much of that as you can, whether that's like music that feels right for it, other books that feel right for it, TV shows that you watch on repeat. Descendants, I have to admit, is another one I've watched on repeat before when I need the right tone for something. I watch the weirdest things that have, for whatever reason, just the right tone for like the moment I'm going for. But yeah, so I think weirdly for me, despite the fact I'm very detailed in my world building, when it comes to sort of making something feel more fairy tale-esque, it feels this almost like slightly insubstantial thing. I mean, it's definitely, of course, drawing from folktales more actively. You know, like I mentioned, like my middle grade, which is also a fairy tale retelling, draws very much from like different Grimm fairy tales in a more happy way than these Feather Flames might. And I think, yeah, it's just going in with that very set in your mind and following sort of, I have definitely got bits of world building for Feathered Flames, for example, which I was like, that actually doesn't really work. I need to take that out. It doesn't really fit with the sort of puzzle of this whole thing. And even now, like thinking about it, I can't always pinpoint exactly what it is. It just did not feel right for the book. And that's why, like, one of the frustrating things maybe with writing is that you can't always pinpoint exactly what it is. It's just this kind of like, the vibe is wrong.
The vibes must be immaculate.
Yeah, and you're like, what am I meant to do with that, brain? That's not helpful. But yeah, that's what my brain does. So yeah, watching lots of things, reading fairy tales, reading original ones, reading retellings that do similar things to what I'm aiming for, like all those sorts of things, just yeah, really help get me into the right mindset for whatever it is I want to write.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. Again, I would just like to say thank you to all of you for engaging and answering all of my crazy book reading questions. But is there anything that I didn't bring up? Or is there anything you want to ask any of the authors here today that you'd like to discuss before we have to disconnect?
I would actually love to know.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Everyone say their favorite fairy tale and why.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Allie and I are just on the same wavelength all the time. It's the Once Upon a Time. It's
Regina,
just
Once
how it
Upon a
goes.
Time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, someone else has got to go first.
Yeah.
I love The Two Sisters.
Ooh.
It's the one, if anyone's unfamiliar in the audience, it's the one where there are two sisters walking by a body of water, and in a lot of the stories they're rivals for the same boy they're both in love with, or one of them is engaged to this boy and the other one is in love with him. So one of the sisters pushes the other into the water and drowns her, and the drowned girl's body washes down the river, and a traveling musician finds it and uses her bones to construct a harp, which he then strings with her hair. And the harp proceeds to sing in the voice of the dead girl. And then at the wedding, she sings the story of what happened at her sister's wedding. She sings the story of what happened to her and how she died. And so that's how the evil sister is uncovered.
That sums up all the perfect, like, creepy fairy tale vibes so much in one story, I feel.
Right? Can you imagine how frustrating that would be to be like, I got away with it. I got the guy. We're getting married, and your sister's like, surprise! I'm a harp now.
I feel like this is the reason not to get a band at your wedding. Just have like a playlist.
Just
That is a great reason to have a band at the wedding, least of which, like, no man.
right.
That's the pill inside the pill pocket.
Here we go.
Yeah.
The
Don't hire a
story is get
band.
DJ.
Gone full circle.
Right. I think my favorite is East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which is a
I love
take
that.
on the trope of girl sold to a strange husband she can't see, and eventually does see him. Bad things happen, and I think what appealed to me about that, apart from later on finding it seems like it's just stemming from the same sources like Eros and Psyche, is in the first half of the stories, yes, she makes a pretty profound mistake, but it's also kind of understandable in that, like, she has to sleep next to someone she's never seen before and can't look at. That's a big ask. That's a big ask. But like the next step is like, then she's like, okay, so I've seen this person for who they are. I love them. And now they're gone because I didn't have this faith, which is But she's like, all right, so you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to master the 4 winds to get him back. And I was like, that I like that. That's goals. That is girl bossing your way back into, back to your husband. I appreciate that.
I love that. I think my favorite, for sort of a slightly sort of roundabout reason, is Bluebeard. It's, again, creepy, bloody, all of those sort of traditional grim things. And I have this really vivid memory of being about like 7 or 8 years old. And my grandfather sat down to like read me a bedtime story. And he was like, we're going to read like an old traditional story. We're going to do like a fun fairy tale. And he obviously had not either never read these or not read them for a very long time, because he gets sort of halfway through and there's like blood pooling out of a cupboard. And he's like, maybe this isn't the best for an 8-year-old. But it obviously was, because it really stuck with me. Because also I've always wanted to write some kind of retelling where the woman gets to have her own sort of bloody vengeance in that. So yeah, always stuck with me, that one.
I feel like
I
mine
had
is you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I feel like my favorite fairy tale is kind of a cop-out because it's not a fairy tale, but I still kind of consider it a little bit. But The Tale of the Monkey's Paw, it's a short story, of course, where, Monkey's Paw will grant 3 wishes, but it'll make you wish that you never wanted those things in the first place. And that just became such an intrinsic part of my writing. So I feel like that's very fairy tale-esque, is like the deal that you didn't read the exact terms and
read the fine
conditions
print
before you made
The
it.
fine print.
Get an agent. Have the agent review
your agent read
your
everything.
contract with the fairy.
That's the pill in that pocket, is always read the terms and conditions.
Uh-huh.
I think mine is very similar to Bluebeard. It's an Italian one, How the Devil Married 3 Sisters. And he carries off the first sister and she ends up being thrown into hell, and the second sister, and then the youngest, of course, is clever and good and gets them both out of hell and tricks the devil into returning all of them and steals his treasure. And it's just, what could you get a devil love interest, but you also get, girl boss. So
gotta love it.
Fun. Yeah, I was gonna say obviously Bluebeard, because Ali and I apparently are just the same person somehow. Yeah, I don't know how that's happening. But that wasn't one of my favorites. But both my sister and I were obsessed with for some weird reason was One Eye, Two Eyes, Three Eyes, which is a Grimm fairy tale about 3 sisters. One of them has 1 eye, the other has 2 eyes, and the other one has 3 eyes, which I always thought it was very interesting. And obviously the ones who don't have 2 eyes are the evil ones, which is not very woke nowadays. But like, this aside, it was a very fun fairy tale about just traveling. Like, they travel through like a well and just, have animal friends, and they ask for favors and the animals do them. And so if you treat the animals nicely, they would do things for you. If you treat them badly, they would just like, you're not going to get the prince, you're not going to get the jewels, you're not going to have a fun time. So I think it's also like respect nature, which is a good moral. I mean, we are at this current state of being on Earth, so respect nature might be a good pill as well.
I want to hug that cat so bad.
All the cats.
Look up.
All the cats.
I have my daughter's favorite story when she was little was the 12 Dancing Princesses.
Oh,
I like that one.
And I don't know if there is already a retelling out there in the world. Now I'm thinking about it and I need to go look. But
if you read The Wicked Remain, there is a bit of it, but it's not great.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to put that in all of your heads. So if you do write a retelling, I will read it.
I think House of Salt and Sea is
House of Salt and Sea, that's it,
Yeah.
the ultimate
House of Salt and
Sorry.
Yes.
I got 2 out of.
I was like, there's salt in that, I know.
Okay, I got to put that one on my TBR pile now because I have not read that one.
Gaslighting, the fairy tale. I love that one.
Okay, well, we're now 5 minutes over. So I just again want to say thank you all so much for joining us on your Sunday afternoon, evening. I don't know what time zone everybody's in. But thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And thank you, Bookstore
so much for
Romance
the
Day, for
invitation.
organizing this event so that we could hear all the stories.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you for
everyone.
hosting.
That was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you,
It
Denise,
was
for
really
hosting.
fun.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. Great questions.
Oh,